Our module this week is going to focus on evolution by natural selection, Mendelian genetics, and how it all leads to human biological variation. We'll ask ourselves, what is evolution and how does it occur? And we'll look at some alternative definitions for evolution. We will talk about different kind of modes of evolution, phyletic evolution, and speciation events. We will talk about heredity, how it is studied, and then we will talk about what forces contribute to genetic evolution. The reason we have to start from this viewpoint of evolutionary theory is that humans are animals. I mean, we just can't really put that point aside. We are not plants, we're not microbes, we're not fungi. We are first and foremost animals. And as such, the principles of evolution that have shaped all life on Earth shapes humans as well. Now, we are unique in that we have multiple ways that we are able to adapt to environmental stresses. We are able to adapt biologically, certainly. We are also able to adapt through technology and using culture. And this is one of the things that's led to our pervasive success, the fact that we find ourselves in almost every possible ecological niche, and the fact that our group sizes have been able to grow so much to the point that we've got pushing 8 billion people on the planet. With cultural adaptation, we manipulate our artifacts and behavior in response to environmental conditions. And we will, in the upcoming weeks, talk about this how this shapes or was shaped through our evolutionary history, in that as we evolved, we kind of changed our capacity to innovate new cultural solutions to things. And that really, I mean, when we think about the myriad of ways that we adapt in a modern context, I mean, culture is often first and foremost. But we also do adapt genetically, and we also have a very easy to pinpoint, easy to measure physiological response to particular kinds of stresses. So, when you just think about the situation of getting cold, right? When you get cold, one of the first things that happens is a physiological response. It is that reflex of shivering, and what shivering serves to do is raise your body temperature through increasing your heart rate and kind of flushing your muscles with more blood that's able to raise then that kind of core body temperature. Kind of beyond that, culturally though, we're able to adapt through our technology as well. If we're cold, we can turn on the heat. If we're cold, we are able to put on extra clothing, a parka, whatever. And then once we've brought our temperature back up to where it needs to be, we're able to maintain that temperature. But when we think about that response to getting cold, I mean, we still have very marked physiological responses. So this kind of push to explain how and why creatures got to be the way that they are definitely predates Darwin. I mean, Darwin is the person who is most closely associated with evolution by natural selection. We had other people who were incredibly important, including Alfred Russel Wallace. Darwin's grandfather kind of philosophized, thought deeply about kind of how creatures changed, how organisms changed and adapted to their environment. So it really was a build-up to what many people think culminated with Darwin, when in fact our explanations and understanding of evolutionary theory have grown by leaps and bounds in this period of time post-Darwin. So many scholars became interested in biological diversity, human origins, classification of plants and animals critically during the 18th century. So what had happened was Europeans were kind of going out on these bouts of exploration, starting and then going on into the 17th and 18th centuries. And in their bouts of exploration, which of course we know very intimately given our large Native American population here in the desert Southwest, that led to conquest, led to colonialism, led to rape, led to outright genocide in many cases. It also brought Europeans into contact with environments with which they were not familiar, and species with which they were not familiar, and then eventually fossils with which they were not familiar. The first attempts out of this European kind of Enlightenment period, this period of kind of creativity and scientific inquiry that came out of the Dark Ages, was creationism. I mean, it was intimately tied with religious explanations for the diversity of life on Earth. And so creationism posits, and this is not something that is strictly related to Christianity. We find creation myths throughout Native American animist religions. We find creation myths in the Australian Aborigines. We find creation myths really in every kind of form of organized religion that's ever existed. So the premise of creationism is that biological similarities and differences originated at this point in time, this point when the earth and all life within it were created. And so, of course, you were probably familiar with the Judeo-Christian accounts of the creation, with God in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, and such. Many indigenous creation myths involve Mother Earth or Mother Nature, a hole opening from the earth from which all life pours forth. Carolus Linnaeus made the first attempt in the 1700s to develop a kind of scientific system of classification, comprehensive system of classification that's still in use today, and we call that taxonomy. And he applied this taxonomic grouping to both plants and animals. And so if you think back to high school biology, the mnemonic device that I used to learn Linnaean taxonomy was kings play cards on fine grained sand. That is kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And we still use this to develop our kind of evolutionary tree, to point to the unity of life on Earth, to identify and classify new species. Fossils that were discovered throughout the 18th and 19th centuries raised doubts, though, about creationism. And I'd like to say that this is something that was limited to the 18th and 19th century, and that as we gained more scientific knowledge, that these weren't prevalent kinds of hypotheses as to why life in the past didn't look the same as life does today. But when I was in college as an undergraduate, so this was about 1992, 1993, back in Virginia, and the area of Virginia where I grew up and where I went to school is well part of what you would consider the Bible Belt that goes across the South. I mean, this was the era of televangelism, of Jerry Falwell, of Billy Graham, of kind of major the buildings of these mega churches. I mean, the person today who's probably most like the earlier televangelist would be Joel Osteen. In my intro to biology class in lab, I had a classmate who was going to be a biology major, who told us in lab class that that the dinosaur fossils were placed in the ground by Satan to cast out upon God's divine creation. So this isn't something that kind of went away with more understanding and public dissemination of these scientific explanations. So one such explanation to explain this kind of inconsistency between present and past life was catastrophism. That it's a modified version of creation that accounts for fossils by proposing that divinely authored worldwide disasters wiped out creatures that represented the fossil record. In a modern context, in Kentucky, we have an organization called Answers in Genesis that is founded and was run for a period of time by a man by the name of Ken Ham. He's a pastor. He is, I think, affiliated with kind of evangelical Baptist Christianity, and he has built the Creation Museum in Kentucky, which has things like authentic dinosaur saddles, upon which Adam could have ridden on the back of a Triceratops in the Garden of Eden. So, according to Answers in Genesis, in this kind of purvey of what we call young Earth creationism, Ken Ham has put forth that there were dinosaurs in Eden, and soon thereafter. But then when Noah kind of faced great tragedy with the rising floodwaters that were deposited all over the earth, that God had told him not to put the dinosaurs on the ark. And Ken Ham has gone forth and actually built an ark in Kentucky too, and then wondered why he's not making money with his authentic kind of biblical recreations of these Bible stories. So, evolution or transformism was proposed as an alternative to creationism and catastrophism. And the basic premise of evolution is descent with modification. That is, we're talking about heritable traits. We're talking about things that you inherit from your parents, your grandparents, your great grandparents, and so on, with slight little tweaks. Charles Darwin became the best known of who we might call evolutionists, evolutionary theorists, with his kind of model of evolution by natural selection. He was benefited from earlier scholars. His grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, proclaimed that all animal species shared a common ancestor. So this seed of thought was already in Darwin's mind while he was growing up. He was influenced by Sir Charles Lyell, who's the father of kind of modern day geology. And Lyell proposed the principle of uniformitarianism, which basically states that the same causal pathways, the same causes, will yield the same effects. And so if we can look back through the geological record and get explanations for events, that those same explanations would work with similar kind of ecological characteristics today. And so Lyell posited, for example, that if you had a rate of erosion by a river of only about a quarter of an inch per year, it's only going to take a few thousand years to end up with something as breathtaking as the Grand Canyon. Same kind of principle can be used to explain the height of Mount Everest. Gradual change that accumulates over a very long period of time. And this goes hand in hand with evolutionary theory, because one of the big criticisms of evolution is that we don't see it happening. But what we really have to understand is that the scale of change is on the magnitude of thousands to tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands or even millions of years. And it's really hard for us to pinpoint one single bit of variation in modern contemporary populations that then over, let's say, 1 million years is going to result in the evolution of a new trait. That being said, we have observed evolution happening in the laboratory with species that have shorter lifespans. So we can see bacteria evolve. I mean, how else did we get MRSA, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, or flesh-eating bacteria? That has evolved over really the period of about the past 50 years with widespread use of antibiotics. We've seen changes in the human immunodeficiency virus, HIV. We've seen changes in influenza. So we see evolution happening with this, on the scope of kind of the lifespan of pathogens. We've also seen evolution happening in species like Drosophila or fruit flies, who live on average about 10 hours. So when we're talking about species that have much shorter lifespans, we are actually able to, whether in the lab or in natural populations, observe evolutionary change happening. The problem that a lot of people have then is taking a step back and associating that with kind of the scope of human change or human evolution. So Darwin was influenced by this longer time frame for biological changes that the fossil discoveries were revealing. So for example, one thing that Darwin proposed was that eventually you would find fossils of whales, of primitive whales, that still had functioning pelvis and legs. And he wasn't proven correct until 1996. I mean, whale fossils are hard to find. They were big-bodied creatures. They live in the ocean. The coastlines and such, the proportion of the Earth that was covered by ocean has changed over geological timescale. But, a proposal that Darwin made in the late 1850s, early 1860s was proven 130 years later. So evolutionary theory is something that is constantly being revised, tweaked, fine-tuned with newer and newer discoveries, newer and newer methods and instruments for measuring change. Factually, there's no doubt that evolution is occurring and has occurred. I mean, we as a species evolved. We will look through this in the upcoming weeks. We'll talk about primates next week and find how we have our roots in many primate characteristics. We did evolve from monkeys and apes. Now, it wasn't a one-step process. It's not like a chimpanzee stood up one day like, Caesar in Rise of Planet of the Apes and got some human DNA and then all of a sudden started walking bipedally and talking. No, it's a gradual process over the span of really about 6 million years and we will talk about the myriad of fossil hominins that are all our missing links. There's not one half chimpanzee, half human man out there waiting to be discovered. With respect to modern human populations, we are still evolving. One of the ways is through a relaxed selection pressure on visual acuities. I'd like you to reflect on how many people you know that wear glasses or contacts. Why is that? Well, because we are no longer in an environment where visual acuity matters as much, and we've innovated technology that has then relaxed those selection pressures. Think about hunter-gatherers. If you were a hunter-gatherer living 100,000 years ago and you had bad eyesight, you would not be chosen as a mate because your hunting return rates, your skill, was dependent upon being able to see and track prey. Lactose tolerance. If you had cereal with milk this morning for breakfast, you have herders in the Middle East about 8,000 years ago to thank because that's that point in our evolutionary history where we had a mutation that allowed us to continue to enjoy milk and milk products well into adulthood. So we now have a third of the population that is not born with wisdom teeth. We haven't needed wisdom teeth since we innovated fire and started cooking our food roughly 800,000 years ago. But it's taken until this point in human evolution to have a larger proportion of the population born without wisdom teeth. And so if you were one of those lucky third of the population, pat yourself on the back. You don't have to go through oral surgery when you're around 18 or 19 years old. Darwin proposed a theoretical framework for understanding evolution with natural selection as the mechanism. When we talk about a theory, we're not talking about something that somebody just kind of proposed that has very little evidence to support. Theories in science are well supported with hundreds, if not thousands, of hours of observation. And a theory is defined as a set of principles regarding causal connections between variables that unites previously unconnected observations in a common framework and is able to generate new predictions about previously unstudied relationships in a fashion that can withstand the scrutiny of empirical observation. Laws in biology don't yield predictions. So we can say that we have a law of gravity, but how do we explain gravity? How do we use gravity to propose new explanations for things? We use, for example, the theory of relativity to explain movements of objects in space and such. So evolution is factual. It has occurred. It is occurring. But the theory that proposes or that explains evolution and allows us to generate new predictions is natural selection or evolution by natural selection. I mean, this is what's going to enable situations like the Disney film WALL-E to come true, right? Have we become fatter as we've become more sedentary? Absolutely. Do we face the potential of destroying our planet through a buildup of garbage? Absolutely. Is there the possibility for kind of evacuating the Earth and preserving us in space? Absolutely. So the theory of evolution is a set of logically connected ideas that are formulated to explain evolution. Natural selection as a mechanism is defined as the selection of favored forms through differential survival and or differential success. This is most obvious when we have competition for strategic resources. This can be food, this can be water, this can be breeding territories, this can be mates. To work, there has to be variety within the population. So there are kind of three criteria that have to be met. First, there has to be variation. It's not, we're not going to see a large proportion of the population born without eyeballs, for example. We're generally born without eyes. Our eyes may vary in how they work. We may need to utilize technology to be able to see 20/20, but most humans are born with eyeballs. That variation has to be heritable. Think about the people that you know that have piercings or tattoos, right? That's certainly variation in the population. I myself have Curious George on my back. But my kids weren't born with tattoos. That's not variation that's heritable. So many of the things that we do to our bodies later in life, even with radiation exposure and cancer, unless our gametes are affected, unless that mutation is passed on through our eggs or our sperm, it's not going to be under selective pressures. It's not going to be kind of the venue of evolution. So we've got to have then heritable variation that is associated with differential survival and or differential reproduction. If it doesn't make a lick of difference in our ability to survive and or reproduce, it's not going to be selected for or against. So, we can think about things like Alzheimer's disease. Right? We're seeing a greater proportion of the adult population with things like Alzheimer's disease and other disorders associated with dementia. Why aren't those being weeded out of the population? Well, they don't really affect survival. It might be the difference of dying when you're 85 versus dying when you're 90. And the key critical catching point, sticking point, is that you don't discover that you have Alzheimer's or you don't develop Alzheimer's until after you've already gone on and reproduced. So you've already gone on and passed on those genes for developing a late in life disease or disorder. So Parkinson's disease, the same way. When those things set in after we've already had our children, there's no way to kind of weed them out of the population. So variation in a trait, that variation has to be heritable. That variation has to lead to either differential survival and or differential reproduction. Then there must be evolution by natural selection. Competition is what enables this differential survival and or reproduction. And for this, Darwin has Thomas Malthus to thank. Thomas Malthus is considered the father of modern day demography, modeling population numbers. And Malthus was a devout Christian and really was plagued by the fact that he thought God was loving and took care of everyone, but he saw great suffering in the poor predominantly. And he eventually built some demographic models that it told him this was inevitable, that this was the basic kind of framework for life on Earth, that our ability or any population's ability to reproduce is theoretically infinite, but that infinite reproductive potential is kept in check by competition for these key critical resources. And so, among the poor in Europe in the 1800s, the poor had lots and lots of babies, but what happened to many other babies? Well, many other babies died from starvation, from kind of exposure to disease, the plague, and such, cholera, other kinds of diseases that going to spread in close contact and spread with poor sanitation. And so, inevitably, many of their babies would die because of these conditions and their lack of access to medical care, to food, to kind of personal hygiene, etc. So this is that venue that allows natural selection to occur.